In this video, we're going to build an authentication REST API with Node.js, TypeScript, Typegoose, and Zod. The features that the REST API are going to have are you're going to be able to register a user, you're going to be able to verify a user's email address, you're going to be able to send a forgot password email, you're going to be able to reset a password, get the current user, and then you're going to be able to log in, create access tokens, and refresh tokens. So we're going to be using these technologies listed out here. And to follow along, you're going to need Postman, Node.js, and a running instance of MongoDB. If you don't have any of these, this is a good time to pause the video and go download and install these applications. And this is the video structure that we're going to be following. We're going to do a demo, and then we're going to do a code walkthrough, and then we're going to get started building out the application. So if you would like to test out the application before you start building it, or you want to follow along, there will be a link to the GitHub repository in the description below. And in that repository, you will find a Postman collection JSON file. So you can import this JSON file into Postman, and you'll have all the requests needed to test out the API. So once you've imported the collection, you're going to have an auth API, and then you're going to have a user folder and an auth folder. So inside a user, you're going to be able to register a user. So before you send any request, make sure you have an environment set in the top right-hand corner of Postman. So I'm going to register a user. And then once I've registered a user, it's going to send an email, and we're going to get a preview link here for the email. So I can open up this preview, and inside of the email, we're going to get a verification code, and we're going to get an ID. So I'm going to copy this verification code here, and I come back to Postman, and we have this verify request here. And inside the verification code, I'm going to replace what I currently have in there. And then I'm going to set the ID as well. And you can see that I've successfully verified this user. So we can also reset a user's password, and this is going to request an email be sent to that user. And then once we send that email, we will get another preview link inside of the console here. So we can open this up, and you can see, just like when you register a user, you get a password reset code and you get the ID of the user. So I can copy this password reset code, and I can come back into Postman, and I can replace what I have here. And I can also grab the user's ID, and we can reset the password. You can see here that I'm using environment variables. So I have password 2 set here, and password 2 is just going to be password 123, while password is just going to be password. So let's reset this user's password. Now we can log in as this user, and you can see that we're going to get an access token and a refresh token. And there's a test script here that's going to set environment variables for the access token and refresh token once you successfully log in. So now that we have a valid access token, we can get the current user. And if you have a valid refresh token, you can use that token to refresh your access token. So we can send this request here to refresh the session, and you can see that we get a new access token. And whenever we send this, we're going to get a new access token. So inside of the repository, you'll notice that we have this config folder here, and we have a source directory. So if we open up the source directory, we have everything sorted by layers. So I have controllers here, and then I have services, models, and we have some middleware and routes. And so our requests are going to come into routes, and then the route is going to call a controller, and then the controller is going to call a service, and then the service is going to call models. If you want to, you can organize your code by user and auth and session, but I prefer to organize my code by these layers here. So inside of config, we have this default.ts, and default.ts just exports an object, and this is some default configuration that we're going to be using in our application. And then we have this custom environment variables, and this is going to tell the config module to get these environment variables from our .env file. So you can see here, for example, we have this access token private key. And then if we open up our .env file, you can see that we have an environment variable for this token here. So these public and private keys are base64 encoded keys. So if you want to generate some new keys, there is a link here to this Travis Stidwell JSON crypt demo. And you can use that to generate some keys, and that's a really easy way to do it. And then you can base64 encode the keys, and then you can put them into your .env file. So you can see that we have a public and private key for our access token, and then we have a second public and private key for our refresh tokens. Don't use these keys that I have in here because, as you can see, everybody is going to be able to see these keys, and I'm not going to add my .env to git ignore. I'm going to commit this to the repository. So if you use these keys, you will get hacked. So let's get started building this REST API. So I'm in a new VS Code window here, and I'm going to initialize my application with yarn in it. I'm going to be using yarn for this tutorial, but you can also use npm. I'm just going to press enter for all of these and use the default, and this is going to generate a package JSON. Next, I'm going to initialize TypeScript, and I'm going to use npx TypeScript --init, and this is going to create a tsconfig file for us. So during the video, there will be a couple of things that we need to change in this tsconfig file, but I'll show you those as we run into those problems so you know exactly why we're changing them. The next thing I'm going to do is to install some development dependencies. If you clone this repository, you'll see this notes file here, and this is going to have all the install commands for you. So you can just copy and paste these. So the next thing I'm going to do is to install Express, and I'm going to install Express at version 5, and this is going to let me pick the version that I want to install. So I'm just going to pick the latest, which is 5.0.0 alpha 8. And then finally, I'm going to install my dependencies. So you can see that command just here. So I'm going to come into the root of the directory, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm just going to call this src. And inside of src, I'm going to create an app.ts file. And then I'm just going to console.log hello YouTube. Let's save that file, and then we can come back into package.json, and I'm going to create a scripts. And then inside of scripts, I'm going to create a dev command. And this dev command is what we're going to be using to start up our application. So I'm going to say ts node dev, and then I'm going to give this a respawn flag and a --transpile only flag. And then I'm going to tell it which file I want to start up, which is source/app.ts. So I'm going to say source/app.ts. So let's type yarn dev and see if this works. So you can see we get hello YouTube, and if we save this file, it should restart and print out. Let's just make sure we're getting the new version, and we get hello world. So we are good to start. The first thing I'm going to do is to require .env, and .env is going to be used to get our environment variables from our .env file. So I'm going to say require .env, and then I'm going to call .config. I'm going to import Express from Express. I'm going to import config from config. I'm going to initialize Express by saying const app equals Express. And then I'm going to say app.listen. And app.listen takes a callback, and it also takes a port. So to get our port, let's say const port equals config.get. And then we want to get a property called port. So let's add our port down here. And then we can just add a console.log app started at HTTP localhost, and then we can add our port here. So this isn't going to work yet because we have no config defined. So I'm going to create a new folder, and this folder needs to be in the root of your directory. So I'm going to call this config, And then inside of config, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this default.ts. So when you go to deploy your application, you'll also need to create a new file in here, and you'll need to call this production. Config is going to expect a file for each of your environments plus default. So if you have an environment for test, you can create a new one called test as well. So inside of default, I'm just going to export default, and I'm going to export a object, and then I'm going to define a property called port, and that's just going to be 3000. Let's start this again. And you can see here we get app started at localhost port 3000. So this is looking good. The next thing we want to do is to create our database connection. So I'm going to come into config, and I'm going to create a DB URI, and I'm going to set this to MongoDB ://localhost 27017. And then I'm just going to call this user API tutorial. So inside of source, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this utils. And inside of utils, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this connect to db.ts. And I'm going to import Mongoose from Mongoose. And I'm going to import config from config. I'm going to say async function connect to db. And then I'm going to get the db URI from config. So I'm going to say const db URI equals config.get. And then I can come to our default, and I can just copy this name here. And then I'm going to say try, and then I'm going to catch this error. Then I'm going to say await mongoose.connect, and then we're going to connect to our db URI. And if we run into an error, I want to exit with a status code of 1, which just means that we've exited with a failure. So now let's export our function as default. So export default connect to db. And you'll notice that TypeScript is complaining here because type unknown is not assignable to type string. So connect expects a string, but db URI is type unknown. So config.get, you can see here, takes a generic. So we can define that generic here as a string, and then TypeScript is now going to be happy. Let's come into our app, and we can call connect to db, and we can just execute that function. And I have a little syntax error here. See, I'm using array brackets. I actually need object brackets. And then I also need to get rid of these dangling commas here. So we don't know if we've connected to our database. We need to log out whether we've connected or not. So come into utils and create a new file and call this logger.ts. And then we're going to use Pinot to create a logger. So I'm going to import logger from Pinot. Going to import day.js from day.js. And we're just going to use day.js to format the date and time. And then I'm going to import config from config. So I'm going to say const level is equal to config.get. And then we're going to get a property called log level. And log level is going to be a string. We need to add log level to our config. And I'm just going to make this info. Then you say const log equals logger, and we're going to execute logger, and we're going to put in some options as an object. So I'm going to say transport, and then transport is going to be an object, and target, and then in target, I'm going to use Pinot pretty. And then I'm going to put in our level, and then I'm going to add a base option, and then I'm going to say PID, which is process ID. And then I'm just going to say false for that. I don't want it to print the process ID. And the next property is our timestamp. And then our timestamp is just going to be a function. And our function is going to return a string. So I'm going to do a comma. And then I'm going to say time. I'm going to add a full colon. add another string here, and then I'm going to say day.js dot format. So you can format this log however you like, but this is how I like to do it. So let's come back into our connector DB, and then I'm just going to say log. So we need to export log as default. So I'm going to say export default log. And then I'm going to say log.info. And then I'm just going to say connected to DB. And you can see here we get an info log that says connected to DB. Let's come back to app.ts and we can change this console log here to a log.info as well. And then I'm going to move this string down into our info log. I'm going to save that. And you can see here we get a nicely formatted time and we get an info level log. So the next thing I want to do is to configure my routes. So I'm going to create a new folder inside of source and I'm going to call this routes. And then inside of routes, I'm going to create an index.ts. Then I'm also going to create a user.routes.ts. And I'm also going to create an auth.routes.ts. So you don't have to split your routes up like this. And you definitely don't have to use auth and user, but I'm going to use these files here. So if we come back to the README, and if we have a look at our features here, you can see that these are all going to be user-related routes. So registering a user, verifying a user's email address, sending a forgot password, reset password, and getting the current user. And then for auth, we're going to have login, and we're also going to have the ability to get a new refresh token. So inside of our routes and index file, I'm going to import express from express. And I'm going to say const router is equal to express.router. And then we need to execute that. I'm going to say router.get. And I'm just going to have a health check endpoint here. So I'm going to say health check. And then my health check endpoint is just going to respond with a status code of 200. So inside of the callback function here, we're going to have a request and we're going to have a response. We're not going to use the request, so we can just replace that with an underscore to denote that we're not actually going to use that property. And then I'm going to say res.sendStatus, and I'm going to send a status of 200. So to use our routes here, we'll come back into app.ts, and I'm going to import routes from /routes. And then I'm going to say app.use, and I'm just going to pass in our routes. And I'm actually going to call this router. So you can see here that we don't have any exports. So come back into the routes and index file. And this router that we created with express.router, we need to export that as a default. So we can export that. And then to make sure that our routes are responding, we can open up a new terminal here and I can just say curl. And then I can say localhost port 3000/health check. And this is just going to make a GET request, and you can see we get back an OK. So this means that our application is up and running and responding to requests. So let's configure our user and auth routes as well. So this is going to be very similar. I'm going to import express from express. And you definitely don't have to set up your routes like this. I'm just showing you a way to set up your routes. I'm going to say const router is equal to express.router. And then again, I'm going to export default router. So basically all of our routes files are just middleware for Express. So let's copy this and I can paste this into our auth routes and then come back into the index file. And I can import user from /user routes, and then I can do the same with auth routes. And then under our health check endpoint, I can say router.use, and then we're just going to use our user routes and our auth routes as middleware. So the first endpoint that I want to set up is going to be our create user route. So I'm going to say router dot post, and then I'm going to have this listen on /API/users. And then we require a handler here. So I'm just going to add a callback, and then I'm just going to add my request and my response. And for now, I'm just going to respond with a 200, just so we can start our application back up. So let's create a new folder here. I'm going to call this controller. And then I'm just going to create a new file inside of controller called user.controller.ts. And then I'm going to create another folder. I'm going to call this service. And then inside of service, I'm going to create a user.service.ts. And then I'm going to create one more folder. I'm going to call this model. And inside of model, you guessed it, we're going to create a user.model.ts. So let's start building out our model, and then we can go back to our controller and we can start building out our handler. So we're going to use Typegoose, and the reason we're going to use Typegoose is because from this file here, we're going to export a TypeScript interface as well as our model. So I'm going to start off by saying export class user, and then user needs a capital U because it's a class. And I'm going to say @prop. And @prop is going to come from typegoose/typegoose. We can execute that prop. And we can say email is going to be a string. And then inside of prop, I'm going to put my Mongoose options. So I'm going to say lowercase is true because I want all emails to be lowercase. I'm going to say required is true because a user is required to have an email address. I'm going to say unique is true because all email addresses registered within the system are required to be unique. So you can see here, it says experimental support for decorators is a feature that is subject to change in future releases. Set the experimental decorators option in your tsconfig file or jsconfig file to remove this warning. So it's telling us here to set experimental decorators. So we can do that in our tsconfig file, and we can come and find experimental decorators, and you can see that it is commented out here. Let's remove that comment, save it, and it's set to true. Come back to our model. And you can see that the original error has gone, but we have a new error here. And then to fix that problem, we need to come back into our tsconfig file, and we need to find this property called strict property initialization. We can uncomment this, and then we need to set this to false. Come into user model, and you can see that this has fixed that error there. Let's say @prop, and I'm going to add a prop called first name, and this is going to be a string. I'm just going to add one argument here, and that's going to be required, and required is going to be true. And I'm going to do the same for the last name here. And then I'm going to do the same for a password. And we're also going to have a verification code. So I can say verification code. And then we're going to have a password reset code as well, but we're not going to have any arguments inside of our prop for password reset code because we don't need to set this until somebody requests that their password be reset. So inside of verification code, we want to add a default here. So I'm going to say default, and then our default is going to be a function. And then our function is just going to execute nano ID. So you can see we're using nano ID here, and then this is imported from nano ID. So we need one more property on here, and this is going to be our verified prop. So I'm going to say verified, and this is going to be a Boolean, and we want to default this to false. So when somebody first registers their account, we're going to set verified to false, and then once they verify their account, we're going to set this verified to true. So we can export our class here as a model with a function from Typegoose. So I'm going to say const user model is equal to get model for class. You can see that also comes from Typegoose. And then I'm just going to put my user class in here. I'm going to say export default user model. So there's a few more things we need to do to our user model. We need to add some default model options. So I'm going to use the decorator that comes from Typegoose called @model_options. And this just takes an object of options that you want to apply to your model. So I'm going to say schema option. And then we want to set timestamps to true. And this is going to add a default created and updated date to our model. And then we also want to allow mixed. So I'm going to say options, and then I'm going to say allowed mixed. And then we're going to use severity, which also comes from Typegoose. And then we're going to call allow. And the reason that we're going to do this is because our password reset code here is string, but we also want it to be nullable. So when somebody resets their password, we can take this password reset code and set it back to null, so they can't reset their password again with an old password reset code. So another issue we have is when a user creates a user document, their password is just going to be plain text. But we don't want that in our system because we want to be able to create a secure user API. So I'm going to use a pre-save hook to hash our password. So I'm going to do @pre, and this is going to come from Typegoose. You can see here it exports a pre, and then we're going to execute that. And we're going to say pre-save, and then pre-save is going to take a callback. So we want to put in our user as a generic on pre. So you can see if you hover over pre, you get unknown here. Well, we actually want to set this to our user class. And that's so we're going to get some type validation when we use this. I'm going to say if not this dot is modified. And then I'm going to pass in our password. So this is going to say, is the password being modified? And if it's not, then we're just going to return out of this function. But if the password is being modified, we want to generate a hash based on the password input. So I'm going to say const hash is equal to await. And then we're going to use argon2. So I can import argon2 from argon2. So argon2 is an alternative to something like bcrypt. But every time I use bcrypt in a tutorial, you guys fill my comment section with comments telling me that argon2 is more secure than bcrypt, like you have a bunch of supercomputers laying around ready to crack bcrypt passwords. That's called .hash. And then we're going to pass in this.password. So now we're going to have a hashed password here. And then we're going to say this.password is equal to hash. So we're just going to replace the password that the user puts in with our new hash here. And then we're just going to return. So now that we have a hashed password, we need to be able to verify that the password they give us during login is going to resolve to their actual hashed password. So let's create a method on our model, and I'm going to call this async validate password. So don't get confused by where I'm putting this. I'm putting this directly on the class here. So you can see we have all of our props, and then we have our method here. So this takes two arguments. The first argument is going to be this, and this is going to be document type, which comes from Typegoose. And we're going to pass in our user. And then the next argument is going to be a candidate password. And this is going to be a string. And what I mean when I say candidate password is it's a password we're going to test against the user's hash password. When the user logs in, this is the password that they're going to supply to us. So we're going to use try catch, so we don't throw any errors in here. We're just going to return false if we encounter an error. So I'm just going to put an E in here, and then I want to log this error, and that's just for debugging purposes. So I'm going to call log.error, and I'm going to pass in E as the first argument, and then I'm going to pass in a string that says could not validate password. And then we're just going to return false. So we're going to return await argon2 dot verify, and then we want to verify with this dot password, which is going to be our hashed password because we replaced the password with a hash up here. And then we want to pass in our candidate password as the second argument. So this is our user model complete. Let's come back to our user controller and we're going to start building out our registration handler. So let's export an async function called create user handler. And this is going to take a request and a response. And we're going to be able to type these up with proper types. So to do that, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call this folder schema. And then inside of schema, I'm going to create a user.schema. And then I want to create a schema that's going to validate our request when we go to create a user. So I'm going to import from Zod. And then from Zod, I'm going to import object, string, and type of. So let's create a constant called create user schema. So I'm going to say export const create user schema. And this is going to equal object. And our object is going to have a body property. And our body is going to be an object. And then we're going to have a first name. And our first name is going to be a string. And then inside of string, we're going to have an object. And then we're going to have a required error. So this is the error that's going to get thrown if somebody tries to create a user but doesn't provide this required field. So this is going to say first name is required. Let's copy this a couple of times. So this is going to be last name. Then we're going to change the error to last name is required. And then we're going to have password. And this is going to be password is required, but we also want our password to be a minimum of 6 characters. So I'm going to call .min. And then inside of .min, I'm going to pass 6 because that's how many characters minimum that our password needs to be. And then we're just going to have an error here that says password is too short, should be min 6 chars. Then we're going to have a password confirmation. So when the user registers, they're required to give us their password, and then they're required to repeat that same password twice. So we know that they haven't made any typos. So I'm going to say password confirmation. And this is going to be a string as well. And then we're just going to have a required error here that says password confirmation is required. Let's have one more property on here. It's called email, and email is also going to be a string. We're going to have a required error. It says email is required. And then our email is required to be a valid email. So we're going to call .email. And then if it's not a valid email, we're just going to say not a valid email. So Zod can also verify that our password and reset password match. So we can hand that responsibility off to Zod and we don't have to include it in our controller, which is really nice. So on our body object here, let's call .refine. And then inside of refine, we take a data property and then we have a callback and we're going to say data.password equals data.confirm password. And then we're going to have an object as the next argument. And this object is going to have a message. And this message is just going to be passwords do not match. So this is just going to make sure that data.password equals data.password confirmation. And if it doesn't, then we're going to supply this message, passwords do not match. We're also going to supply a path for debugging purposes. So this is going to be an array of strings, and this is just going to be password confirmation. So we're going to know that the password confirmation property doesn't match the actual password. So a really cool thing about Zod is that we can, from this schema here, export a TypeScript interface. So I'm going to say export type create user input equals, and then we're going to use this type of function up here. And then type of is going to take a generic, and the generic is going to be type of create user schema. So inside of this input, you'll see that we have body, but we don't want the body to be inside of an object. We actually just need the body property. So you can use the square brackets here and we can get body. If we hover over it now, you can just see we get an interface with these properties here. So if we come back to our user controller, we can type out our request here. So we can say that this is a request and we need to import request from Express. And we'll import response as well. We'll type out response. And then if we hover over request, you can see that it is also a generic. And the first argument is our params, which we don't want. The second is our response body, which we also don't want. And then the third is our request body. So if we open up our generic arrows here, and we say our request params are going to be an empty object, our response body is going to be an empty object, and then our request body is going to be our create user input. So now if we say const body is equal to request.body, and we hover over our body, you can see that we should have a first name, last name, password, password confirmation, and email in here. Okay, so we've typed this out, but we can't at the moment guarantee that this input is actually what we expect it to be. We need the user to receive an error if the input doesn't match the schema. So let's create a new folder. I'm going to call this middleware. And then inside of middleware, I'm going to create a new file called validate resource.ts. So validate resource is going to be a curried function that takes our schema that we created with Zod, and then it's going to take the request and response objects when the user makes a request, and we're going to validate their request against our schema to make sure it matches. Let's import some interfaces from Express. So we're going to need our request, our response, and a next function. Next, we need an AnyObject interface from Zod. Now we can say const validate resource is equal to a function, and this function is going to return another function. So in this first function here, we're going to provide our schema. So I'm going to say schema is of type AnyZodObject. And then in this second function here, we're going to have our request and our response and next. So how this is going to work is we're going to call validate resource with our schema. And then from there, we're going to return this function here. And then this function is going to take a request and response. And then we're going to call try. And we're going to catch the error. And we're going to say schema.pass. And then we want to pass our body with request.body, our query with rec.query, and our params with rec.params. So we can type out our request here and our response and our next function. So if the schema can be passed, we just want to call next. So this request is good to go. If our schema cannot be passed given the payload, we want to return res.status. And we have to call res.sendStatus now. And we want to set our status to 400. And then we want to send e.errors. So we can set e to any, and that will make TypeScript happy. Okay, so let's export this validate resource middleware as default. Export default validate resource. And we can come back to our user routes here. And then we can call validate resource. And then in the first argument here, we're going to call our create user schema. So now that we've executed this function with our create user schema, it's going to return our function that is going to do the parsing of the schema. So we can get rid of this callback here as well, and we can use our create user handler. So I'm going to say create user handler. So now when we get to our create user handler, we can guarantee that our body is exactly what we expect it to be. So with our request body, we want to create a user, but our controllers don't talk to our database. We have services to talk to our database. So let's create a service for creating a user. So I'm going to say export function create user. And then I'm just going to return user model dot create. And then we're just going to call create with some input. And then input is going to come from create user. And then we want to use partial, which just comes from TypeScript. And it means that we're going to select any properties from a interface. And then the interface we want to use is our user interface. So if we come back to our user controller here, we can say try. Then we're going to catch this error. Then we'll say const user is equal to await create user. And then we want to pass in our body. So if we manage to create our user successfully, I want to return res.send, and then the status of send is just going to default to 200. And I'm going to say user successfully created. So you may notice that I don't check to see if the user exists before I try to create it. And that is because on our user model, we have a unique constraint on our email address. So if we try to create the user and the user already exists by that email address, we're going to violate that unique constraint and we're going to throw an error. And so we're going to come down to our catch block here. So now we just want to say if e.code is equal to 11000, which means that a unique constraint has been violated, then we want to return res.status, and then we want to return a status of 409. And then we want to send a message that says account already exists. And 409 just means that there is a conflict. Otherwise, we want to return res.status 500.send, and then we can just send along the error. So this looks good, but when we create a user, we want to send them an email address that has a validation code and their user ID so they can verify their email address. Let's come down to utils, and I'm going to create a new file called mailer.ts. So I'm going to use emails here, but you can use anything you want, really. You could use push notifications, you could use SMS if you want, but I think email is the most commonly used because it's so simple to set up. So I'm just going to use a fake SMTP server, which stands for Simple Message Transfer Protocol. But if you want to deploy this application to production, you definitely don't want to be using this test SMTP server. You want to be using a real server that's going to send emails to your users that aren't going to get blocked. So before we create our mailer, you can see in the console we're getting this error. User.emails type is invalid, type is undefined. So to fix this error, we just need to come into our tsconfig file and find this emit decorator metadata And we need to uncomment this and set this to true. And you can see our application will start back up again now. So the first thing we need to do in our mailer is to get some test credentials. So I'm going to say function create test creds. And then inside of this function, it actually needs to be an async function. I'm going to say const creds equals await node mailer. Import node mailer from node mailer. And then we can call dot create test account. And then we just need to execute this function and console.log our creds, console.log creds. And then we somehow need to get this function here to execute. So I'm just going to create our send email function. So function send email. And this also needs to be an async function. And then we can call this function inside of our user controller. So we can open up the user controller. And then when we've created our user, I'm just going to execute the send email function. And I'm going to await send email. We also need to export default send email. And then we need to import send email from util/mailer. So because we've imported this function here, we're going to require this whole file, and then this create test creds is going to get executed. And now you can see in the console, we get some test credentials. So I'm going to open up my default config, and I'm going to create a new property called SMTP. And then this is going to be an object. And then I'm just going to copy in my user and pass. And then I'm going to create a host property. And this is going to be the SMTP. We're not going to use IMAP or POP3. And then the port is going to be 587. And then secure is going to be false. When you deploy this application to production, you're not going to be using these credentials here. And you're going to be using a proper SMTP server, and you want to set secure to true. Let's come back to our mailer and we can start filling in our send email function. So before we do that, we can get rid of this test creds because we don't need to print out our credentials every time we start up our application. So I'm just going to comment that out so you can grab this code in the GitHub repository if you need to. And I'm going to say const SMTP is equal to config.get. And we obviously need to import config from config. And then we're going to get our SMTP property. So node mailer is going to complain because SMTP is unknown. So we're going to have to provide a type here so we can use each property on SMTP. So I'm going to say user is going to be a string. Pass is going to be a string. And if you're wondering where I'm getting this from, I'm just copying it from what we put into credentials here. So then host is also going to be a string. Port is going to be a number. And secure is going to be a Boolean. So now down inside of send email, we need to provide a payload. And to send an email with node mailer, we need to create a transporter. So above send email, I'm going to say const transporter is equal to node mailer dot create transport. And then this is going to take a object as the argument. And I'm just going to spread SMTP. And then I'm going to provide another property called auth. And then auth is going to have user, which is going to be SMTP dot user. And then pass, which is SMTP dot pass. So you could create this transporter inside of the send email function if you like, but I wouldn't recommend doing that because every time you execute this function, it's going to create a new transporter where we just want to create a new transporter when the application starts up. and then we can use that transporter for as long as the application lives. Now we can call transporter.sendMail, and the first argument is going to be our payload. And then the second argument is going to be a callback. So our callback is going to take two arguments. It's going to take an error and it's going to take info. And we're going to say if error, then we're going to log the error out. So I'm going to say log.error, and then I'm going to pass in the error as the first argument, and then a second argument of a string that's going to say error sending email. So if we don't get an error, we're going to log a preview URL. And if we see this preview URL, we know that the email has been sent successfully, and we're going to be able to open that preview and see what the email looks like. So I'm going to say log.info. I'm going to say preview URL. And then to generate the preview URL, I'm going to call nodemail.getTestMessageURL. And then we just need to pass in our info prop. So to make sure that we don't log this, if we get an error, up inside of our error, we just need to return. So you can see here that payload right now is of type any, and we don't want that. We want to type out payload. So if we come in to send email, you can see that mail options takes a mail.options interface. And then you can see that there's lots of options on here, but this interface isn't exported. But luckily, NodeMailer does export an interface that we can use, and it's called send mail options. So if we copy that interface and then we can type our payload with send mail options, and then you can see that send mail options just references mail.options, which is all of our options here. So if we come back to our user controller, you can see that send email now is telling us that we haven't provided a payload. So let's provide that payload. So I'm going to say from is test@example.com. And you obviously want to make this your email address that you're sending emails from. 2 is going to be user.email. Subject is going to be please verify your account. And then text. And text is going to be the body of the email. I'm just going to provide a string here. And I'm going to say verification code. And this is going to be user.verification code. And then I'm going to provide an ID, and this is just going to be the user's ID. So I'm going to say user._ID. So now if we go over to Postman, we should see that when we call create user, we send an email. So if we send this request here, you can see that we get an invalid type and expected an object, but we received undefined, and this is at path body. So this means that the body of our request is undefined, and this is not what we expect. But in Express, we need to use some middleware to pass the body. So if we come back into our app.ts, we can say app.use, and then we're going to use express.json. So previously you would use something like body parser, but you don't need to do that anymore. You can use express.json as middleware. Let's send this request. So if we come back to Postman, you can see that we're still getting this error. So the reason that we're getting this error is because of the order that we have our middleware. So you can see that we have app.use, and then we have router, and then we're calling our express.json. We need to move this above our router. And this is a really important concept in Express. The order of your middleware matters. Let's come back to Postman. We can send this request, and you can see that we get user successfully created. So we should see a preview link in our logs here. Let's open that up. And you can see that we have a verification code here, and we have an ID here. So we can use this to verify a user. So let's make our endpoint for verifying our user. So I'm going to start with the user controller this time. So I'm going to say export async function verify user handler. And inside of this function, we're going to get a request and a response. We can type these with request and response. And we also need to make a schema for this handler. So let's do that now. Inside of user schema, I'm going to say export const verify user schema equals object. So you'll notice a naming pattern here. So I call the schema, and then the type ends with input. And they all start with, for example, with create user, they all start with create user. And in the controller, we have create user, and then this is a handler. So for verify user, we have verify user handler, and then we have verify user schema, and we're also going to have verify user input. So for verify user schema, we're going to use params, and params are going to appear inside of the URL. And our params are going to be an object, and we're going to have an ID, which is going to be a string, and we're also going to have a verification code, which is going to be a string as well. So I can copy this, and I'm going to call this verify user input. And because it's a type, I'm going to use a capital for the name. And then we don't want body, we want params. And also need to change this to verify user schema. Let's come back to our controller, and we can type out our request here. So if we hover over this again, you can see that params are the first parameter here. So inside of our params, let's call verify user input. Now I can say const ID is equal to request.params dot, and I should get my ID here. And say const v equals rec.params dot verification code. Then I'm going to copy and paste that because I'm lazy. Next, we want to find our user by the ID, and then we want to check to see if they're already verified. So let's type this out. Find the user by ID. Check to see if they are already verified. Then we want to check to see if the verification code matches. So to find a user by the ID, we need to create a service. And we're going to call this find user by ID, export function find user by ID. And it's just going to take an ID. Now ID is going to be a string. And then we're going to return user model dot find by ID, and we're just going to pass in our ID. So say const user equals await find user by find user by ID, and then we're going to pass in our ID. So next we want to say if not user, then we're going to return res.send could not verify user. And then we will say if user.verified, then we want to return res.send user is already verified. Otherwise, we want to check to see if the user.verification code is equal to the verification code that they put in. And if it is, then we want to say user.verified is equal to true. Then we want to call user.save. And then we want to return res.send user successfully verified. So if the verification code is wrong, we want to return res.send could not verify user. And I'm just going to move these comments up here. And then we can come back to our user routes and we can create a route for verifying a user. So I'm going to say router dot get. And in the Postman collection, actually, I'm going to say router dot post. So this endpoint here, I have as a post, but it could also be a get. If you send the user an email with a link to click to verify their account, you probably want to make this a get request. So I'm going to make this listen on /API/users/verify. And then I'm going to have the ID in the URL as a param. And then we're also going to have the verification code. And we want to use the validate resource middleware to make sure that we have an ID and verification code in the URL. So I'm going to say validate resource, and then we're going to use the verify user schema. And then we're going to call the verify user handler. So let's go test this endpoint now, and this should work. So we're going to call verify user. I'm just going to call it with something that we know is wrong for now. And yep, could not verify user. So now that we know it works with invalid credentials, let's try with the ID and verification token that we got previously. You set the ID here. And then I'm going to set this verification token. Notice that the text has a full stop, so don't include that in the verification code. And now we have our user successfully verified. So unfortunately, I can't zoom in with Robo3T, but you'll just have to trust me here that there is a hashed password and the verified property is now set to true. So now let's move on to requesting a password reset email. So inside of our controller, I'm going to say export async function forgot password handler. We're going to pass in our request and our response. And we're also going to create a validation schema for this. And this is all going to feel very repetitive. And that's a really good thing because it means that your code is really predictable. So I'm going to say export const forgot password schema. It's equal to an object and this object is going to have a body, which is also going to be an object. Then we're going to have an email, which is a string. And then we're going to have a required error. And we're going to say email is required. And then we're also going to make sure inside of Zod that it's a valid email address. And the reason we're doing this is because if it's not a valid email address, we just want it to throw an error inside of our validate middleware, and we're never actually going to get to the database request for emails that are invalid. So we're just going to say not a valid email. It's good to rely on these sorts of validation schemas where you can. And that means that you don't have to program custom logic where it's not really necessary. So let's create a new type, and I'm going to call this forgot password input. And it's going to be type of forgot password schema. And then we're going to get the body. Let's come back over to our user controller and we can type out our request here. And remember, the body is the third parameter. So I'm going to say forgot password input. So I'm going to say const equals rec.body. And then we're going to get the email out of the body. And I say const user equals await find by email. I'm going to pass in our email address. So we need to create this find by email function here. So I'm going to come over to user service and I'm just going to copy our find by ID. And I'm going to change ID to email. Name this property. And then I'm going to say find one. And then we want to find one by the email. So this will work and it's perfectly fine. But if we're going to be finding users by this property, we want to add an index on the email address. And it makes the lookup a little bit quicker. So if we come over to the user model, we can use an index decorator. So I'm going to say at index, and this is going to come from Typegoose. And then I want to pass in an object as the argument. And I'm just going to say email, and then I'm going to provide a property of 1. So now let's come back to our user controller, and then I'm going to import find user by email. And now we're going to have our user. So we're going to add a couple of tests before we actually send out an email. So I'm going to say if not user, then we're going to return res.send. And we don't want people to be able to spam this endpoint to test what users are actually registered with our system. So I'm going to say const message, and I'm going to make this equal to a string. And it's just going to say if a user with that email is registered, you will receive a password reset email. So now if the user doesn't actually exist, we just want to send this message. And this message is a little bit misleading, but it means that people won't be able to spam our system with different email addresses, testing to see which ones are actually registered, because that would be considered a security flaw in your application. For debugging purposes, we want to log a message here. So I'm just going to say log.debug. And then we want to say user with email. No, we can pass in the email does not exist. So if you're hitting this condition here, you're going to get a debug log and you're going to be able to debug your system a little bit easier. So now let's say if not user.verified, then we want to return res.send, and we want to say user is not verified. So we don't want the user to be able to reset their password or log in if they haven't verified their account yet. The business logic around this may be a little bit different for your system, but this is generally a pretty common use case. So we want to generate a password reset code. So I'm going to say const password reset code is equal to, and I'm just going to use nanoid, and I'm going to execute nanoid. And you can see this should have been imported from nanoid. Yep. So it's just going to create a random string for us. And I'm going to say user.password reset code is equal to our new password reset code. And then I'm going to call await user.save. So the reason that we can do this is because we've just found the user with this find user by email, and we can change any property we want. And then we actually get this save method here. If we come into find user.email and we call .lean here, and then we come back to user controller, we won't be able to call .save, because when you call .lean, you just get the JSON object of the actual document. And so you can see that TypeScript is complaining here and it's giving us a helpful error message. So if you want to be able to use lean sometimes and not other times, you want to pass that in as options. So if you hover over find one, you can see that you get some options and you can just pass those into here. Now we want to send an email to the user telling them what their password reset code is. So I'm going to say await send email. And then we're going to say to is user.email from, it's going to be test@example.com. Again, you want to make this your business email that you're sending emails from. Subject is going to be reset your password. And then our text, I'm just going to, again, put in a string here that has password reset code and the user's ID. You probably want to render some HTML and send them a nice looking email. So I'm going to say password reset code. I'm going to put in our password reset code that we created up here on line 93. And then I want to say ID is equal to user._ID. And the reason that we're going to send the ID along is because we want to use that to look up the user. Now let's say return res.send, and we're going to send along our message. So if you want to add a debug log, we can say log.debug, and then we can say password reset email sent to, and then we can just pass in the email address. Okay, so we need to hook a router up to this. So let's say router.post, and I can say /API/users. So you'll notice that all of our routes inside of the user route start with /users, and this is going to denote that they're responsible for this user's resource here. So if we had a post router, for example, all of our routes would start with router.post, and then we would have, sorry, let's use product as an example to not get confused with post, the HTTP method. We'd have /API/products. And the convention is to use plural as the resource. And then I'm just going to make this forgot password. And we're going to validate resource again. And the resource that we're going to validate is the forgot password schema. And then we're going to call the forgot password handler. So we can come over to our Postman collection and we can request a reset password. When we create a user, you can see that we set the email address as an environment variable. And then we have this email here. So this email is going to match the email of the user that we created. If we open up and have a look, you can see here it says Cindy Lauren. And if we have a look in the database, that should match the email of the user that we have on file. Yeah, it does. So now let's send this email and we get back, if a user with email address is registered, you'll receive a password reset email. So you can see here we have a preview URL. And if we open this up, you can see we have a password reset code and our user's ID. Now let's create an endpoint so we can use this and reset the user's password. This time, let's start with the user schema. I'm going to say export const reset password schema is equal to an object. And our object here is going to have both params and a body. So I'm going to say params is going to be an object. And then we're going to have a body, which is also going to be an object. So in our params, we're going to have an ID, which is going to be the user's ID, which is going to be a string. You can put a message here if you like. I'm lazy. And I'm not going to put one. Then I'm going to put a password reset code. And again, that's going to be a string. It's quite hard to send this request without these params, because if you do, then it's not going to match the actual route. And so it's not really that important to put an error message here because it's unlikely that these are going to get hit. The reason that we do this is more for when we're in the controller and we can type it out with the request generic. So for our body, we require a password and a password confirmation. We also required that up here in this body. So let's just copy this. And I can paste our password and password confirmation down into our reset password schema. And then we also need to make sure they match. So let's copy this refine here. And on body, we can call refine, and we can make sure that they match. Let's come back to our user controller, and we're going to create a handler for resetting a password. So I'm going to say export async function reset password handler. We're going to have our request and our response and our request object. Then we're going to have our params here. And then we're going to have our response body, and then we're going to have our request body. So for this schema, we're going to do something a little bit different. So you can see here we're using our body and params, but this schema here has both a body and params. So I'm going to copy this down, and then I'm going to say reset password input. It's going to be a type of reset password schema, and then I'm just going to remove the body portion. And then when we come over to our user controller, for our params, we can say reset password input, and then we can grab the params from here. And then for the body, we can say reset password input, and we're going to grab the body. Let's say const, and we're going to destructure the request params, so equals rec.params. And we're going to say ID and password reset code. And then we're going to grab the new password out of the body. So I'm going to say const equals rec.body. And then we're going to grab the password out of here. We can also type this response out as well. So now I'm going to say const user is equal to find user by ID, which is a service that we created earlier. We can find the user by the ID. And we need to await this, otherwise it's going to return a promise. So now we can say if not user or not user dot password reset code or user dot password reset code is not equal to our password reset code, then we're going to return res.status. And then the status we're going to send is a 400. And then we're going to say send could not reset user password. So what are we doing here? We're going to check to make sure the user is actually registered. Then we're going to make sure the user has a reset password code. If you remember on the user model, we made this nullable. So it can either be a string or it can be null. If it is null, we're just going to return this error. Or if the password reset code on the document doesn't match what the user gave us, we're going to throw this error as well. Okay, now we're going to say user.resetPasswordCode is equal to null. So this means that they can't use this reset password code again, because this check here on line 124 is going to catch it. Then we're going to say user.password is equal to password. Then we're going to call await user.save. And then we're going to return res.send successfully updated user password. Let's just say successfully updated password. So you may be wondering why we can just set this password like this and we don't need to hash it. And the reason we can do that is because we have a pre-save hook on our user model. So when we're going to save our user, it's going to say, okay, we're going to be modifying our password. Let's swap it out for a hash. Let's come back to our user routes. I'm going to say router.post. I'm going to say /API/users/reset password / and then I'm going to put the ID. And then the next parameter that I'm going to use is a password reset code. We're going to validate resource. And we're going to use the reset password schema. Then finally, we're going to use the reset password handler. Let's come back over to Postman and let's try this out So I'm going to send this here and it says could not reset user password. And the reason for that is going to be because the ID and reset password code are incorrect. Let's get these from our email. But before we reset the user's password, let's just check to see what happens when we put in two passwords that are different. You can see here it says passwords do not match, which means that our schema is picking this up for us, which is really good. So now let's send this request again. And now we have successfully updated the user's password. So before we can get the currently logged in user, we also need to create a login route. So before we create the login route, we're going to do a little bit of preparation. So I'm going to create a new file. This is going to be called session.model.ts. And I'm going to export class session. I'm going to use @prop. And then this session is going to reference the user. It's going to say user. And then I'm going to use ref, and ref comes from Typegoose. And then inside of ref, I'm going to use user. So because this is a reference, and this is the TypeScript definition here, and then this is going to be the Mongoose definition, we need to set up the reference from Mongoose. So I'm going to say ref, and then ref is going to be a function that returns the user class. Then we're going to have another prop, and this prop is just going to default to true, and this is going to be valid. And then this is going to be a Boolean. So if our session becomes invalid because the user tells us that they want to log that session out, we can set this to false, and then we won't be able to create refresh tokens for that session anymore. So say const session model is equal to get model for class, and then we're going to pass in the session, and then we're going to pass in a object of options. So before, in our user model, we used this model options. So this is just a different way with Typegoose to add model options. So we can say schema options, and then we can say timestamps is true. Now let's export our session model, export default session model. The next thing I want to do is to create a utility for signing and verifying JWTs. So inside of utils, I'm going to say jwt.ts. Then I'm going to import JWT from JSON Web Token. I'm going to import config from config. And this file is going to export two functions. I'm going to say export function sign JWT. And I'm going to export a function called verify JWT. Okay, to sign a JWT, we need a payload. I'm just going to call this object, and this is just going to be of type object. We need a key name, and our key name is going to be either access token, private key, or it's going to be refresh token private key. So the reason that we're doing this is because we're going to use this sign JWT function to sign both access tokens and refresh tokens. And we're going to sign each of those tokens with a different key. So we need to know which key we're going to be using to sign the token. And finally, we want to have some options. This is going to be a optional input. And I say jwt.sign options or undefined. So the first thing we want to do is to get the signing key. So I'm going to say const signing key is equal to config.get. And then we want to get this by the key name. So inside of our config, we're going to have keys with the name both access token private key and refresh token private key. And if we have a look what we have in our .env file, you can see here that these are base64 encoded keys. So to decode the base64, we need to wrap config.get in a buffer.from. And then buffer.from is going to take our string, which is our actual key in base64 format. And then we're going to say base64. And then we're going to say toString. And then this is going to be ASCII. Okay, the last thing we need to do is to return a signed key. So I'm going to say return jwt.sign object. And then we say signing key. And then we want to have some options. So if options is defined, we want to spread that onto our object here. So we can do that with ... open up a bracket, say and then options. And next we want to set the algorithm to RS256. And this just means that we're going to be using public and private keys. So if this user API is part of a microservice architecture, you can share your public key around to other services safely, and then they can be used to also verify this JWT was signed by this user API. So TypeScript is complaining here because buffer.from wants a string. So we can use our string generic, and that's going to keep TypeScript happy. So this isn't going to work because we don't have our access token private key or refresh inside of our config. So let's define those, and I'm just going to define them as empty strings. And then I want to get them from environment variables. So inside of config, I'm going to create a new file. And this new file is going to be called custom environment variables.ts. And then in here, I'm going to export a object as default. Move my config over. So we need an access token private key. We also need a refresh token private key. We also need an access token public key. And we need a refresh token public key. So what this is going to be doing is it's going to say for this property, which matches our default config here, use this key to get it out of our environment variables. So open up your environment variables, and then you can see the key that it's set. So you can see access token public key here, access token public key, and then this name here is going to match what you have set in your .env file. So you can say access token private key. I have refresh private key. A little bit inconsistent with the naming here, but that is okay. And refresh public key. Okay, so we're going to be able to get our signing key here, and then we're going to be able to sign a JWT with that key, and then we're going to return it. Now let's create a verify JWT function. So a verify JWT is just going to take a token, and this is the JWT that we want to verify, and it's going to take a key name. So our token is going to be a string, and then our key name here is going to be similar to this, but we're going to use a public key to verify the token. So this is going to be access token public key or refresh token public key. So let's copy this code here. And we can just call this public key. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to get buffer.from, and we're going to get it from base64 encoded format. And then we're going to say try const decoded is equal to jwt.verify. So if jwt.verify can't verify the token because it's signed by a different key or it's expired, it's going to throw an error. So we need to catch that error. And then we want to verify our token, and then we want to use our public key to verify the token. So if we catch an error, let's just return null. And if we don't catch an error, then we want to return our decoded key. So verifying a JWT is a little bit annoying because you don't know what's going to come out the other side. And so we can use a generic to tell verify what it should be returning. So you can see here, it's just going to return a string or a JWT payload, but we don't actually know what that is. So let's create a generic here with T, and then we're going to say as T. And then we can say that verify JWT either returns T or it returns null in case that we catch an error. Okay, so we're ready to create our login handler. So let's create our schema first. So I'm going to create a new file inside of schema. I'm going to call this user. I'm going to call this auth.schema.ts. And I'm going to open up my user schema so I can copy and paste. So I'm going to copy all my imports. So I'm going to import object, string, and type of. Then I'm going to say export const create session schema is equal to object. And then to create a session, we want to pass in a body. And the body is also going to be an object. And inside of the body, we're going to have an email, which is going to be a string. And it's also going to be an email. And we're going to pass in a password. And our password is going to be a string. And we know from when we create a user that a password has a minimum of 6 characters. So if they pass in a password that is less than 6 characters, we know that it's wrong when we get to the validation stage, and there's no need to even go to the controller. So let's say min 6, and let me say invalid email or password. So if their password is wrong, again, we want to be a little bit vague around the message that we give back to them. So if they don't provide an email, let's say require error, and we can say email is required. And then for password, we can say required error. It's a password is required. And then if the email address is invalid, we're just going to say invalid email or password. Again, we just want to be quite vague around what errors we're sending back to them. So let's export a type. And we're going to call this type create session input. Again, our types start with a capital letter. And we're going to say equals type of. And this is going to be type of create session schema. Okay, so we can come to our controllers and we need to create an auth controller. So I'm going to say auth.controller.ts. So if you were to create another authentication strategy, such as Google OAuth or GitHub OAuth or Facebook OAuth or SAML, then you would use your auth controller to handle all that logic. You wouldn't use a different controller, and you wouldn't use your user controller because this is for updating the user resource, where the auth controller is for managing all of the authentication code. Let's create a function here, and I'm going to say export async function create session handler. And we're going to have a request object, which is going to be of type request. And we're going to have a response, which is going to be of type response. And we need to import these from Express. Import from Express. And we can type out our request. So we're not going to have any params. We're not going to have any response body. But we're going to have a create session input, which VS Code doesn't want to import for me. So I'm going to have to import this manually. And that is because I have it in the body of the function. I actually want it in the arguments. So I'm going to destructure the body and get the email and password out. So I'm going to say const equals rec.body. We know the body because we've typed it up here. So we can say email and password. Now we can say const user is equal to await find user by email. This is a service that we created earlier. We can find user by their email address. And we're getting error here. Property email does not exist on type body. And that is because in our auth schema, we haven't exported this as just the body. So we can go back in and we can add the square brackets and body. Now we can say if not user, then return res.send. And I want to send back a vague message here. So in our schema, we use this message, email or password, invalid email or password. Let's copy that. And I'm going to define a constant called message, const message, it's equal to, and I'm just going to use this invalid email or password message. And I just want to send that back. Again, because we don't want to tell the user that makes this request which users are registered in our system and which users are not registered. So now we can say if not user.verified, then we can return res.send, please verify your email. So the next thing we want to do is to verify that the password that the user gave us is in fact that user's password. So I'm going to say const is valid is equal to await, and then I'm going to call user.validate password. And the reason that we can call validate password is because on our user model, we created this validate password method here. And then our validate password method is going to take our candidate password, which is the password from our request body. And then we can say if not is valid, then return res.send message. And then the next thing we want to do is to sign a access token. And we want to sign a refresh token. And then we want to send the tokens. So to sign these tokens, I want to create some services to do that for us. So if we have any other authentication strategies, such as OAuth inside of our application, we can just use these services to sign some tokens, and we don't have to repeat our logic over and over again. So inside of service, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this auth.service.ts. And I'm going to say export function sign access token. And I'm going to say const payload is equal to our user, and we're going to get user in through the arguments. And our user is going to be document type, which comes from Typegoose, and it's going to be of type user. This is our user class. Dot to JSON. So we just want to convert our user to a plain JSON object. Next, we want to say const access token is equal to sign JWT, and we're going to use our sign JWT utility that we created earlier. I'm going to sign it with our payload. And then we want to sign it with our access token private key. And then we just want to return our access token. So let's create another service for signing a refresh token. And when we sign our refresh token, we're going to also create a session. So I'm going to say export async function sign refresh token. And we're just going to take in a user ID, and our user ID is going to be a string. So I'm going to say const session equals await create session, and then we're going to create a session with our user ID. So let's create this create session service. So I'm going to say export async function create session, and create session, as we know, is going to take a user ID, which is going to be of type string. And then we're just going to return session model.create. And we're going to create it with our user as a user ID. So now that we have our session created, we just want to sign a refresh token that references this session. Then when we go to create a new access token, given this refresh token, we need to then just check that the session is valid and in our database. And if it is, we can sign a new access token. So I'm going to say const refresh token is equal to sign JWT. And then this JWT's payload is going to say session. And then we're just going to reference the session ID. So I'm going to say session dot underscore ID. And then the key that we're going to use is the refresh token private key. And then we just want to return our refresh token. Okay, let's go back to our auth controller, and then we can use these two services we created to create an access and refresh token. So I'm going to say const access token is equal to sign access token, and I'm going to pass in our user. Then I'm going to say const refresh token is equal to await, because this is an async function. Let's just double check that we didn't create sign access token as an async function. Otherwise it would return a promise and would need to await it. But there's no need for sign access token to be an async function. So we can say sign refresh token. And then our user ID is going to be our user dot underscore ID. Now let's return res dot send, and I just want to send along our access token and our refresh token. So let's hook this up to our router, and we should be able to log in now. So I'm going to say router.post/API/sessions. Then I'm going to say validate resource, say create session schema. And then we're going to use create session handler. So let's go over to Postman, and we can test this login route. And you can see that we get an access token and a refresh token. So the login request in the Postman collection is going to set the access token and refresh token for you. So if we open up the environment variables, you can see that it has the access and refresh token set. So now we can implement the me handler, and this is going to return the currently logged in user. So before we make the handler to get the current user, we need to make another piece of middleware, and this is for deserializing the user. So in the middleware folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this deserialize user.ts. So all this piece of middleware is going to do is to get the access token from the authorization header, and then decode the access token or verify it, and then attach the user to the res.locals property. So I'm going to say const deserialize user equals async, and then we're going to have a request, a response, and a next object. Let's import the types for these from Express. So we have request, response, and next function, just like we did in the validate resource middleware. The next is going to be a next function. And again, I've put these in the function body, but they need to be in the function arguments. response is going to be a response, and then request is obviously going to be a request. So before we forget, let's export default deserialize user. And then we're going to say const access token equals, and if we go back to our Postman collection, you can see in our auth header, we have a bearer token, and then we have this access token here, and this is our environment variable. So if we open up the console and send this request, you can see in the request headers, we have this authorization header, and then we have bearer and a space, and then we have the access token. So we need to get this token out of the authorization header. Let's say request dot headers dot authorization. And then I'm going to say or an empty string, because the authorization header may not be present and we don't want this function to throw an error. So we can wrap this. And then we need to replace the bearer with an empty string. So I'm going to call dot replace. So if the authorization header wasn't present, then we would be calling dot replace on undefined, which is not going to be valid. We need to call dot replace on a string. And then I'm going to pass in a regex here. So I'm going to say // caret, and I'm going to say bearer s, and then I'm just going to replace this with an empty string. So we have our access token here. So we're going to say if not access token, then we're just going to return next. But if we do have an access token, we're going to try to decode it. So I'm going to say const decoded equals verified JWT, and we're going to get this from our JWT utils. And then we're going to pass in the access token, and we're going to use the access token public key to verify this token. And then we're going to say if decoded, then that means that we have a user object, and we're going to attach the user to res.locals.user equals decoded. And then you can call next in here, but then you would also need to call next outside of here. So we can just remove that next, and then we can return out of this function. So how do we use this middleware? Well, we want to deserialize the user on every single request, and we don't want to have to add it to each route because we might forget some. So inside of our app.ts, I'm going to call app.use, and then I'm going to pass in deserialize user. Again, the positioning of this matters. So if we were to do this below our router, res.locals.user wouldn't be accessible inside of our routes. So now that we've deserialized the user and we've attached the user to res.locals.user, we can go inside of our controller and inside of user controller. And I'm going to say export async function get current user handler. And then we're going to have a request and a response. And response is going to be of type response. And request is going to be of type request. And then we simply need to return res.send res.locals.user. And then we need to create an endpoint for this handler. So inside of our user routes, I'm going to say router.get /API /users/me. And then I'm going to call the get current user handler. So now if we send a request to me, you can see that we get back our user, but there's all sorts of fields on here that we shouldn't be displaying to the user. So we have our password reset code, and we have a hashed password, and we have our verification code. So let's go ahead and make sure that we never output these fields to the user. So I'm going to come back to the user model, And I'm just going to export an array of private fields. So I'm going to say export const private fields equals an array. And this is just going to be an array of fields that we want to be private. So our first one is going to be password. The next one is going to be __v. Then we have our verification code. And we have our reset password code and our verified status. We don't want to output that either. So when we sign our JWT, we want to remove these fields from the user. So let's go into our session service. And when we call user.toJSON, we want to omit our private fields. So I can import omit from Lodash. So I'm going to import from Lodash omit. And then I'm going to wrap our user.toJSON in omit. So I'm going to say omit. And then the second argument is going to be private fields. So let's go sign a new token with login. And then get the current user. And you can see here, we only have our publicly available fields now. So another issue with our tokens is that we haven't set an expiry on them. So if we come into our auth service, when we sign an access token, let's say we want this to expire in 15 minutes. So because we're passing in some options, we can say expires in, and then we can just say 15M, which is going to be 15 minutes. And when we create a refresh token, we can let the refresh token expire in, say, 1 year. I'm going to say expires in, and then 1Y. So I'm going to log in again, and I'm going to get the current user, and you can see that we now have an expiry on our access token. So if our access token expires, we want to be able to refresh it, and that's where this refresh access token endpoint comes into play. So come over to the auth controller, and I'm going to export another function that says function refresh access token handler. We're going to have a request, and we're going to have a response. And I'm going to say const refresh token is equal to get, and I'm just going to use get from Lodash here. Come down to this one, and I'm going to pass in the request object, and then I'm going to get this from headers.x refresh. So if we go over to Postman and we have a look at this request, in our headers, you can see that we have x refresh, and this is set to our refresh token. So I'm going to decode this token. Const decoded is equal to verify JWT. And then we're going to pass in the refresh token. And then we're going to pass in the refresh token public key. Then I'm going to test to see if it has been decoded. So if not decoded, then we're going to return res.status 401.send could not refresh access token. If we could decode the token, I'm going to say const session equals await find session by ID, and we need to create this service. So let's go do that now. In our auth.service, I can say export async function find session by ID. It's just going to take one argument, which is an ID, and that is going to be a string. Then I'm going to return session model.find by ID. I'm going to pass in the ID. So find session by ID, and then we're going to get decoded.session. So when we signed our refresh token, you can see that we added session, and this is the session ID. So let's say decoded.session. And you'll notice that TypeScript doesn't like this, but luckily we passed a generic into verify JWT, so we can use that now. So we can say session is going to be a string. And you can see now that TypeScript knows that decoded has a session string on it. So we can say if not session or not session.valid. So if the session has been set to invalid, then we're going to return this error message again. Otherwise, we're going to say const user equals find user by ID. And we're going to cast the user ID to a string. So we can use the string constructor here. And we can say session.user. And then if we don't have a user, we're going to send back our error message again. So you could define this message in a constant above, and that might be quite nice. So if not user. Otherwise, we're going to say const access token equals sign access token. And we're going to pass in our user object. Then we're going to say return res.send. And we're just going to send back the access token. So TypeScript is not happy with this, and this is a really confusing error. But the only issue is that we haven't awaited this. So this is going to be a promise instead of an actual object. And now TypeScript is happy. So let's come into our auth routes, and we're going to say router.post/API/sessions/refresh. And this is going to be our refresh access token handler. Let's come back to Postman, and we can open up our refresh access token request. And you can see that we're setting the header here. You can see that we get a new access token, and we can send it again and again and again, and we're going to keep getting a new access token. So there's one last piece of middleware that might be handy, and that is to make sure that the user is logged in. So there's some routes that you might want to protect, and you want to make sure that the user is logged in before they can hit those routes. For example, the user route where they get the currently logged in user, you don't want just anybody to be able to hit this route. You want to be able to check that the user is logged in before they get to this handler. So let's go into middleware, and I'm going to create a new piece of middleware, and I'm going to call this piece of middleware require user.ts. And I say const require user equals a function. And our function is going to take a request, a response, and a next function. And again, we can import these from Express. And then we can type our parameters here. So because we have our deserialized user middleware being called up here, and then all of our routes are underneath, by the time we get to this piece of middleware, which is going to go on our actual route, such as here, we know that the user is going to be on res.locals.user. I'm going to say const user equals res.locals.user. And then I'm just going to say if not user, then I'm going to say return res.send status 403. Otherwise, we're just going to return next, and we're going to continue through the flow. Export default require user. Now we can use this middleware on our routes. So if we come over to our user route and the me request, I can say require user. And now this route won't get to the get current user handler unless the user has a valid access token. So let's try it out. So you can see we get the current user. Let's go over to our headers, and I'll just remove the access token. And you can see that we get a 403 forbidden instantly. Add our access token back, and we get the current user. So that is how to make a user authentication REST API with Node.js, TypeScript, Typegoose, and Zod. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a thumbs up, a comment in the comment section below, and make sure you subscribe to my channel for future updates. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.